Okay, so our next speaker, John is the Chief of Science of Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Australian Wildlife Conservancy is, in my opinion, one of the best conservation organizations in the world right now, probably. What they have achieved in the last 20 years is quite amazing, very outcome-oriented. And he's gonna talk about translocations in Australia. And before we start this interview, we're gonna see a video about the 30 years of Australian Wildlife Conservancy.
Australia's unique biodiversity is facing a crisis. Introduced predators like feral cats and foxes, feral herbivores, weeds, mismanaged fire, and the impact of a changing climate are driving Australia's wildlife to extinction. Australia already has the worst rate of recent mammal extinctions in the world, and scientists predict more species will become extinct over the coming years unless we take urgent action.
Australia now is the guardian of a unique collection of animals, mammals, birds, insects, flowers, unlike anything else in the world. And it's all in your hands.
Australian Wildlife Conservancy takes a practical, science-based approach to conservation. It's an innovative model that involves working alone or in partnership with pastoralists, Indigenous groups, government, private landholders and universities to deliver the best possible outcomes for wildlife on a vast landscape scale.
That's why AWC is so very important. And science runs through the whole activities of AWC in a most admirable way. There are a lot of ingredients to success in conservation. Part of it, of course, is money. Part of it, of course, is having the area where you can do things. Part of it, of course, is having science behind you. And part of it, of course, is having dedicated people who give their lives to dealing with these problems.
30 years ago, Australian Wildlife Conservancy's founder Martin Copley had a vision to act upon the alarming rate of biodiversity loss in Australia. Over 3 decades, one property in the southwest of Western Australia has led to the creation of Australian Wildlife Conservancy, which now owns, works in partnership or manages 31 sanctuaries spanning more than 6.5 million hectares in some of the most iconic regions in Australia.
Effective fire management, feral predator and herbivore control, weed eradication, and the rewilding of endangered species are critical tools in Australian Wildlife Conservancy's Conservation Toolkit. Australian Wildlife Conservancy also conducts the largest biodiversity monitoring program in Australia. It's a massive effort, but it's vitally important because it allows us to build an inventory of the species that we protect and to measure our progress on the ground. It's the only way we can be sure we're generating the best positive outcomes for wildlife.
As we look back over the last 30 years, we acknowledge our staff, our partners, our volunteers, and our wonderful supporters who have helped Australian Wildlife Conservancy grow to be the largest owner and manager of private land for conservation in Australia. We're making great progress. Australian Wildlife Conservancy now protects 74% of Australian mainland mammal species, 88% of native bird species, 55% of reptile species, and 54% of amphibian species across our network of sanctuaries and partnership areas across Australia. Despite our progress, however, across the rest of the continent, Australia's extinction record continues to escalate. 34 mammal species have gone extinct since European settlement. Australia's threatened species list has increased by 36% in the last 15 years. A further 1,800 species of flora and fauna hang by a slender thread. We need to take decisive action now if we're to prevent more species being added to Australia's extinction record. Over the next 30 years, we'll be deploying more ecologists and more land managers in the field at the front line of conservation where they can make the biggest difference for Australia's wildlife. We'll collaborate with more Indigenous groups to help care for country. We'll engage with pastoralists and private landholders to expand our reach. And we'll rewild more threatened species on private and government land. In other words, we're significantly expanding our partnership model in order to achieve the best possible outcomes for our biodiversity. We're rewriting the future for biodiversity in this country. We're providing hope for Australia's threatened wildlife and their habitats, now, for the next 30 years and beyond.
Be passing around the hat later on.
Yeah, we're going to show the presentation now.
Okay, so look, thank you, Ignacio, for inviting me here. It's wonderful, really, to be part of this event. I've learnt a lot already. Look, I'm sort of I feel I'm here under false pretenses. I'm not particularly a maestro, but our team, I think, is. So I'm presenting on behalf of a team. Jamie, can you raise your hand? So Jamie helped contribute to this, and as did a bunch of other people. And Ignacio also asked me to not just focus on my organisation, but to speak more broadly about conservation translocations in Australia. So I've reached out to 4 prominent practitioners who are colleagues, and they've provided input as well. So thanks to Catherine, Peter and Adrian. Just a bit of background to Australia, which I think sort of is important to understand the work that we do. It's, I think it's the smallest continent, but it's still pretty big. It's 15 times the size of Spain, and it's mostly dry, so semi-arid, shrubland, sort of things we call Mediterranean ecosystems, because I guess they're wet in winter and hot in summer. And over in the east coast, there's some eucalypt forest and patches of rainforest and some montane sort of landscapes. It's been an island continent for tens of millions of years, so it's got a very diverse biota that's highly endemic. So over 90% of species in many vertebrate taxa are endemic. And you might recognise some of them here. They're sort of associated with Australia: the platypus, koala, kangaroo, and that's palm cockatoo. Australia's had modern humans for longer than Europe. It's had modern humans since at least 50,000 years ago, probably a bit longer. They rapidly settled the country, and within a few thousand years, 20 species of megafauna were extinct. So we don't have any fantastic large mammals to rewild. We make do with the cute and cuddly stuff that's a bit smaller. 4,000 years ago, the dingo was introduced, a dog, and within 1,000 years or so, the 2 largest marsupial carnivores went extinct where the dingo could reach, which is on the mainland. It survived, both of them survived in Tasmania, which was isolated at that time. And then, just over 200 years ago, my ancestors and most other ancestors of Australians came to the country, so very, very recently. Still, we've managed to do a lot of transformation in that time. So this is a map of the Indigenous languages, which are essentially tribal groups in Australia. So you can see it was completely settled, and I think there's hundreds of separate languages represented there. One of the things that the Aboriginal people did almost everywhere they could was do fine-scale burning for hunting mainly, and that This is an aerial photo from the 50s when the British were testing rockets in the Australian desert. They took some photos to see what was beneath where the rockets were. There were some Indigenous people still living there. And this pattern of light and dark is the fire pattern that Aboriginal people created out there in the deserts. That's highly important for habitat for a lot of these small animals that a lot of our translocation work is concerned about. But we dispossessed, the white people dispossessed the Indigenous people, and their fire management ceased. We've been busy, we're still busy bulldozing a lot of habitat for agriculture. That's sort of slowing down, but it is still happening. We introduced many species, and in terms of the species we translocate, these three introduced species are the most problematical. So the cat, which is the domestic cat, which has just escaped to be feral, the European fox, red fox, and the rabbit, which you're trying to increase, we're trying to do the opposite. It's led, as my boss said on the video, to over 100 extinctions and 1,700 threatened species. Some really amazing things have gone forever. So the paradise parrot, which is considered the most beautiful Australian bird, is extinct. A frog that brooded its young in its stomach. A relative of the banana, which who knows what genetic material that would have contained against banana diseases. So massive losses, but particularly in the mammals. The mammals have been hardest hit. And this graph shows why, of these 4 different mammal groups, when you look at the threats, it's cats and foxes that have driven most extinctions and are still contributing to declines. So that's the problem we've got with mammal conservation in Australia, far and beyond anything else. When you map it, the red on this map is the greater proportional decline, the green is the less. So you can see it's very much a southern Australian phenomenon. You can more or less draw a line across the continent and sort of above and below. I think that's a factor of where the rabbit and fox have reached, and also a sort of aridity. It's more drier in the south and more open and easier for cats and foxes to hunt. And this is illustrated by 3 beautiful wallabies in the genus Onychogalea, the nail-tail wallabies. The crescent nail-tail wallaby in the south completely gone, it's extinct. The northern nail-tail above that line, completely untouched. And the bridal nail-tail, which crosses that divide, is only persisting in one population to the north of that line. So that's the pattern of mammal decline in Australia that the conservation translocation work that our organisation does attempts to address. Just a couple more bits of background. The extinctions are ongoing. Mammal extinctions are currently occurring in Australia around 2 per decade. We lost a rodent to climate change. Its island vanished within the last 20 years. And we've just had some megafires 2 years ago, which resulted in massive loss of species. 80 species were uplisted as a result of those fires. And it's happening in the marine world as well. We've just had another mass coral bleaching event on the Barrier Reef. There's been increasing. You can see the timeline there, 2002, 16, 17, 20, 22. It's not looking good for the reef. So you were going to ask me a question about the legal and political context here. Ignacio.
Yeah, I mean, you provided the ecological context, and now more so they understand the legal context there.
Okay.
But remember not to give too much information.
So he's warned me. He reckoned I wrote a book,
I
he gave me an 80-minute talk, right? So that's what he gets for asking that. So briefly, Australia has a national government and state governments, and they all make environmental laws. We don't have the 5 levels of administration that you seem to have here, but we certainly have 2, and they're both interesting to deal with. We also have the Indigenous native title, which has only recently been legally recognised. So 40% of Australia now has, the Indigenous people have one form or another of legal title. And the rest of the country, increasingly our society is recognising that attachment to land. And so that matters when you're translocating animals that have deep meaning for the Indigenous people. In terms of land use, half of Australia is used for grazing of livestock, mostly in unmodified landscapes that are just running around on the grass under the trees. 20% is conservation land, and another 15% is unmanaged, which is essentially desert. There's tiny bits of the country really that are intensively used. It's a very low population density out in the outback. And now would you like to ask me about the history?
No, you go with the history of translocations in Australia.
Try to make this a dialogue.
Everything is so clear that, yeah, you go.
Thank you, Ignacio.
Yeah.
So Australia's translocation history started back in the 19th century with koalas. Moved to a number of islands, and then from there moved to some more islands, and then eventually moved back to the mainland. These were introductions, so probably go back far enough that koalas would have been there, but they weren't there at the time. And there's like 25,000 koalas moved around the place, quite a massive project. Then into the 20th century, koalas still figure, and there's still introductions. They tried to get them going in Western Australia. There was a massive reintroduction program on Kangaroo Island, introduction. What's that, 24 species, birds, mammals and reptiles. Lyrebird went to Tasmania. So again, all introductions and a sort of a little bit eclectic. When you get to the second half of the 20th century, you get to the modern era. So these are all conservation translocations taken of mostly the mammals that are most vulnerable to cats and foxes, so the sort of small to medium-sized mammals, the native rodents, the small wallabies, etc. And the stars there show the locations where this happened. Mostly they were government, but NGOs like our own started to play a role. And you can also see that they were mostly in a couple of Australian states. That's sort of historical where the animals survived. Then when you get to the last 20 years, it's exploded. It's in all states and territories. It's increased from mammals to more birds, to invertebrates. And what's new on this, in terms of the proponents, is there's a whole lot more partnerships. So it's really interesting sort of change in who's doing the work. For the mammals, which I'm going to focus most of my presentation on, there's two sort of main ways that they're done. Because the predators, the introduced predators, the main problem, people try to find places where there aren't predators or where they can remove them. So there's been a whole lot of work done to islands, and that's mostly government. We have one island, but mostly the islands are owned by the state. And then the other way of doing it is to build these big fenced areas on the mainland and to eradicate the cats and foxes and rabbits if we can. Apologies to those in Spain for that, but it's mostly an NGO or partnership space, and so this work has not always been supported by government because it's sort of challenging their ownership of the sort of conservation space. Anyway, that's the modern world. Just really what I want you to get out of this bit of the talk is that the amount of activity is dramatically increased. The proponents have changed from governments through to private and partnerships. There's much more emphasis on conservation, translocations. We really don't do any introductions anymore. They're mostly multi-species. So they're sort of ecosystem restoration, rewilding type projects. Ignacio also asked me to talk about influences. You can't, in Australia, forget the indigenous knowledge. This is a species of bettong. So this is essentially the Australian rabbit. This would have been the most common marsupial in Australia. There would have been hundreds of millions living in warrens all throughout the country. But essentially we knew virtually nothing about their distribution because they vanished very quickly. There was a couple of zoologists who went around with skins and museum specimens to Indigenous groups, said, do you remember this animal? Yes, we do. It was important to us. You know, it was an important food animal, important as a totemic animal. Okay, where was it? And they've mapped it. And that's then been translated into where we think this species occurred. And that then influences what permissions we can get from government to where we can introduce this species. There was also various forms of influence from the settler society. So we had a lot of crazy Englishmen who had grand plans to introduce everything that they were used to, from foxes to hunt, to, you know, rabbits for food, to all sorts of things. But there was a can-do attitude. So that's what you saw in all those introductions to islands. People just thinking that let's just try this. Then you had some zoologists like this sort of Indiana Jones-looking character called Wood Jones, who was a Brit who worked in Australia, and he saw you could see the mammals declining. If you knew the fauna, you could see there was a problem. So he started some of those translocations to Kangaroo Island that I talked about before. And the third influence is New Zealand. So Australia and New Zealand are quite close geographically. We've got a history of interaction with sort of similar societies. And we've had two symposia like this, one in 1993 and one in 2013 that have produced volumes about, okay, what are we doing? What are the lessons learnt? Where are we going? And we hire people from New Zealand, they hire some of our people, so there's quite a bit of cultural exchange. Right. You happy for me to keep going?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what everything's so ordered that, yeah.
Okay. So Ignacio asked me to talk about the translocations that I was familiar with, but not to limit myself to the ones I'm familiar with. So I can't bang the drum for AWC and pass around the hat and raise money. But obviously I'll talk about our projects because they're the ones that I know. So this map shows all the mammal translocations that I'm aware of in Australia by proponent. So the white stars are government, the blue stars are NGOs or partnerships. This is our project, so those blue stars are our translocation projects. You can see they're mostly in southern Australia, that's where the problem is. We've got other sites throughout northern Australia where we don't do translocations at the moment, although we're planning to, where needed. And we do landscape scale conservation, fire management, feral animal control, etc. I thought I'd show you some of them. So this is, for those of you who know or don't know Australia, this is a classic eucalypt forest scene near Perth. This is in order of the setup of these projects. Same sort of landscape. This is that island out in Shark Bay, a sort of semi-arid shrubland. Then we come to these fenced area projects. We actually sort of acquired these for more or less $1 from someone who tried 2 projects and then went broke. So we took over this project and another one nearby in what we call Mallee country, which is a sort of short eucalypt. We've got a project right in Sydney. If you've been to Sydney, this is North Head. If you come in, sail in through the harbour, that's what you pass by. Another one in Western Australia, a massive one out in the desert at Newhaven. 2 projects with the New South Wales government. We're actually paid to do the work, which is really good. And after those fires that I talked about, we built this fence area that you can see within 6 weeks of the fire to protect an animal that was in that little bit of green shrubbery that hadn't burnt, that was endemic to the island. So that was the benefit of having all this experience behind us, is we could rapidly implement a project in a high need situation. 2 projects happening this year. We're doing one with the Queensland government around reintroduction of this wombat, the largest burrowing marsupial, the northern hairy-nosed wombat. And we've got a project happening in the tropics for a small macropod. I won't, taking Ignacio's recommendations not to go into the detail, I just want to show there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of projects. If you put them up as a matrix of sites by species, that's what we're currently managing. The green are the ones we've done, the yellow and the orange are the ones we're doing or to do, and the ones with 2022 in this year's project. So we're doing 13 projects this year, often going to multiple sites to source them. So it's a busy program. Also wanted to broaden the topic away from my organisation to 4 other projects that span the continent. So I'll just talk briefly about them. This project is called Arid Recovery. It's actually mainly funded by a mining company really in the dry country in South Australia. And you can see they've started off and just built more fences and eradicated cats and foxes as they've gone. And they've got 4 mammals in that spot. They're very interested in predator naivete. So one of the things about a fenced area is you don't have any selection at all for predator awareness. Now, these predators were only introduced in the last 200 years. I'm not convinced this is too big a deal right now, but their setup allows them to put animals in with various densities of cats and see what happens. This is a project right in the middle of Western Australia, run by the government in partnership with traditional owners, that has a fenced area surrounded by a much larger area where they do aerial baiting for foxes and cats. And it's got 5 species in it, and you can see the Indigenous people are part of the show. Completely different is one right, if you've been to Canberra, our capital city, this project is immediately adjacent to Canberra. It's about 800 hectares, and that's a picture of my family just going in there. It's got to be secure, it's got to be fenced at all times, but to build up support from the community, they've got a capacity. You can just walk in, they've got a monitored gate, and it means that people love it. People engage with the idea. And it's a partnership between a university and the ACT government. So you can see there's lots of sort of sciencey stuff happening in there, lots of treatments and replicates and great science coming out of that project. And finally, this is a Western Australian government project. It's 63,000 hectares. It's a big island, completely eradicated the cats from it, and they're going to put 12 mammals back on it that have gone extinct, and they're halfway through that project. So it's a massive project, and we all work together in one way or another. Sometimes we compete for animals, sometimes we compete for attention, but we also help each other. We're sort of colleagues as well. So it's a small enough country and a small enough sector that we all know each other.
Okay, let's just stop there. So we can summarize a little, because, okay, let's see if we can. So clearly Australia is the country or continent, whichever you want to call it, with the highest experience in translocating small and medium-sized mammals in the world. I mean, there's nothing like that anywhere else from what we're seeing. Exotic predators are extremely important as a threat, which isn't so important in other places. And you are using fences as a way to secure areas out of to take out that threat. Okay. So so let's see the results and the challenges. Okay, because I mean it's really staggering the amount of projects that you have there. And the other thing is, this concept of partnership seems to be quite important in Australia. I mean, between states. That seems to be important, and NGOs working with governments, and NGOs partnering with each other. And I think you want to talk about that, and also Indigenous people and all that. So that seems to be important also in the Australian culture of translocations. Is that right?
Yes, it is. So let me talk to those things briefly. In terms of outcomes, there was a pretty thorough assessment of how, so again, apologies for concentrating on mammals, but they are the most threatened taxa in Australia, and the one I'm most familiar with. In 2012, there was a comprehensive assessment of how things are going. Just over 50 mammals had changed their conservation status enough to be either uplisted or downlisted. Well, 4/5 went worse, right? 42 out of 50 something, their conservation status had deteriorated over the 20 years prior to that assessment. 11 had got better, And of those 11, 10 involved conservation translocations. So it's a massive part of turning the Titanic around in Australia.
You point here. You point here, I think.
Hey, it's there, is it? It's not working.
Okay.
Can you advance?
We'll pass it. No, it is the computer that got stuck. Let's see if... Okay.
In terms of what makes the actual translocation successful, it's very much around removing the threat of introduced predators. So here's a wallaby that's had its a bit of it taken out. Translocations to fenced areas or islands without cats and foxes have an 80% success rate, which is pretty good. The translocations to areas where people are trying to suppress the predators through baiting or trapping, it's only about a 50% success rate. And even then, that is sort of elevated by the translocation of species like koalas that aren't particularly vulnerable to those predators. And the sort of result of that is it's going nuts in terms of people building fences and translocating to islands. It's the area which that graph shows of, these type of projects is increasing, and it's part of the governments at the Commonwealth and the state level, the conservation strategy. So that's sort of the outcomes. In terms of, what have I got there? Okay, let me talk about this before the partnerships. People are trying to suppress these predators in the landscape, often through baiting, and Western Australia is leading in this. They've got planes loaded with baits that fly over 3 million hectares every year. It's massive. And it has worked in knocking down the foxes, and that led for about 15 to 20 years to an increase in a lot of these mammals. And, we're talking about long-term, not counting your chickens before they hatch. What also happened was taking out the foxes let the cats increase. So foxes down, cats up, and then this woylie, this bettong, which was delisted because of the success of fox baiting, when the cats built up, it crashed by 90%. It's back in the critically endangered list. So we've got a problem with managing outside these these really secure protected areas. Another sort of problem we've got in Australia, I'm sure this is true of any semi-arid system, is it's a very boom and bust system. So here's one of our properties with this wallaby reintroduced. There's 150 years of rainfall records from the region. This is the last 20. We had the wettest year on record and the driest year on record within a decade, and the population went from 200 to 2,000 and then down to 70. And I shouldn't swear in an audience, but we crapped ourselves, and we ran around and we moved animals around. We tried to pool them to save the genetics, and we squeaked through just. But that issue of drought, severe drought, is predicted to increase with climate change. So we've got a problem. We can't move the fence, right? Well, what do we do? Just one more thing, I'll just touch on this briefly. There's a big issue with genetics. A lot of these species, there's some interesting work looking at museum specimens and remnant populations. Some of these animals have contracted 95% of their range. They've lost a lot of their original genetic diversity, so you're not starting with much. Then you put them into a fence or an island which might support a few hundred individuals, and then you rapidly can lose diversity through drift. So there's a lot of thinking now about how do we manage that through managing the meta population. I think it's doable, but you need to have it as your awareness. And two more challenges. One is the amount of paperwork. So this shows the paperwork for one translocation for one animal that we own on one of our properties to another property, but we're crossing the state border. There's 11 bits of paperwork in there on top of the things that we would do if we weren't asked to do the paperwork, which was to do some planning, to do some monitoring. That's what we'd do. We'd consult with Indigenous people. But the amount of paperwork is incredible, and it really is stopping us getting things done in a timely manner. So that's a problem that we don't quite know how to fix, because as an NGO, we don't own the animals. The government in Australia, the Crown, actually the Queen of England, owns the animals. So good on her. Another problem is, or an interesting challenge, is that when people are attempting these really big projects, and so this Dirk Hartog one I mentioned, 63,000 hectares, it did have a farm at the end of it. And when the government negotiated the project, they said, well, you can keep living there and you can build a little ecotourism venture to make money instead of running sheep. And they didn't put in there, but you can't have any cats. So they spent millions of dollars getting rid of the cats. These people have cats, you can visit there. You know, you're not supposed to bring cats, but, you know, who's going to check in your luggage if your daughter's particularly fond of the pet cat, doesn't want to leave it at home? So there's these sort of interesting human challenges in Australia when we scale up. As I said, we're fairly low population density, but once you get to 60,000 hectares, you're going to bump into some people. And maybe we can show that video about the partnerships. Okay.
We're here this evening celebrating a really important milestone in the partnership between AWC, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and New South Wales National Parks. Tonight we'll be reintroducing 30 bilbies to start the reintroduction program, culminating in 10 species in total to be reintroduced into Mallee Cliffs National Park.
Well, the bilby was across about 70% of the continent, and because of foxes and cats and the other threats, it's now reduced to only 20% of its former range. That's really in a small area of southwest Queensland and up in the western deserts. So this reintroduction back to Mallee Cliffs is really important for the animal because it helps keep the genetic adaptation to this part of the world alive, active.
Well, it's almost impossible to manage cats and foxes in the Australian landscape. The creation of large-scale fenced areas is the only effective way to mitigate the impact of cats and foxes. These are critical conservation assets.
At just over 9,500 hectares, it's the biggest fence of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. The amount of plain wire that goes around this whole fenced area is enough to go from here to Adelaide, which is about 470 kilometres. So it's a lot of material.
The bilbies released tonight will be released into a 480 hectare breeding area. That's part of the strategy and the genetic management plan for the species to encourage the mixing of animals from different source populations. After a period of time, about 2 years, once the population's reached a sufficient size, they'll be released into the 9,500 hectare fenced area that we've developed.
I've got a long history with the park. I've worked here for 25 odd years. So to see one of the extinct species re-released back into Mallee Cliffs is a real highlight for me.
10 of the animals are fitted with coded VHF transmitters, and that will track the survival of the individuals released into the park over the next month, which is a critical period for the establishment of the animals.
Thanks to the rewilding program, we'll be releasing 10 species back into the wild, including bandicoots, burrowing bettongs, and also quolls. So it would be a great thing returning these native animals back to their natural environment.
What we'll have here is a thriving ecosystem with as many of the species that were here put back in and playing their part in the ecosystem, plus helping conserve those species for the future.
The network of fenced areas that AWC has created across Australia represents a significant biodiversity restoration program, reintroducing species in Western Australia, the Northern Territory, New South Wales, South Australia. These are significant programs that are securing the future for Australian species.
So I can talk briefly to why we're doing that. I was saying to someone over lunch that we more or less stopped buying land about 10 years ago, and we've since more or less exclusively done partnerships. You don't have the upfront capital costs of purchasing land, which has become pretty expensive in Australia. and probably everywhere. It gives us access to country that we don't otherwise have. So in New South Wales, where this project is, we just saw in the video, we couldn't get access to high quality vegetation if it wasn't through this type of arrangement. We're also getting paid for doing the project, so that helps. We're making a contribution, but quite a few of the costs are offset. And it gives us some sort of authority or status. It's weird, the government, this government, until our project, had not done any reintroductions for probably 30 years, but by hitching our wagon to them, we get this type of media coverage that you can see here. We can sort of go out and say, look at us, the government trusts us, aren't we good? This other sort of partnerships we're doing are these increasingly partnerships with Indigenous people, and they're quite interesting too. We're actually more or less paying a rent to the communities for them to use the land for conservation rather than cattle or any other purpose. And we employ staff, and we also benefit from their skills. So these rangers here.
The bottom on top.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Just don't want to blind you. You know, are excellent, absolutely excellent cat trackers, and helped us eradicate the cats from that project. It's also part of our social licence. As I said, Australia's becoming increasingly aware that we took over the country by force. We're trying to figure out how to live together, and working with the Indigenous people on lands, whether or not they have sort of traditional title to it or not, is part of where conservation in Australia is heading. We've just last month announced a partnership with a very large pastoral company. As I said, pastoralism covers 50% of Australia. Our own, we have 6 million hectares ourselves, but that's less than 1% of the continent. So if we want to influence conservation outcomes, we've got to get into partnerships with unusual partners. So we're just starting this one, but I'm presuming that this will also be an opportunity for doing some interesting conservation translocation work in the future.
John, it might be a good idea to explain what a pastoralist is, because people are not used to the
okay, well, cattle ranchers. The big, so yeah, as I said, over half of Australia is this particular form of tenure called pastoral lease, which essentially is cattle farmers renting the land long term from the government. Yep. We're doing partnerships with financial entities, and I don't fully understand this. I was talking to Sophie from the UK before about projects that she was doing, but essentially what we're trying to do is direct some of that massive amount of money in the superannuation system and in the corporate world into conservation through setting up bond structures and biodiversity credit markets. And that work has got some, in Australia, we've got some quite heavyweight financial people working on this. What I'm trying to do as a science manager is make sure that they talk to us as well. But anyway, pretty interesting if it works, because it'll massively increase the funds we've got available. It also will make us much more, we'll have to be very diligent in our reporting. So we can't bullshit, to use an Australian term. We actually will have, if serious money's involved, we'll actually have to show that we've achieved the outcomes that we said we would. And finally, there's a lot of partnerships amongst, as I said, amongst the conservation community. It's like a marriage with an interesting but difficult person. You know, there's a lot of collaboration. There's a reasonable amount of arguing. The more cute species, the koalas and so on, get the largest share of the money by a long way, and also have the most fighting for that money. So now here we could look at another video. I could just keep talking. What's our time like?
We're here today at Mallee Cliffs National Park. where 6 months ago AWC, together with the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, reintroduced 50 bilbies into the park as part of an exciting new reintroduction project to restore the greater bilby to a part of its former range where it's been absent from well over a century. Since the bilbies were reintroduced into the park, we've undertaken a couple of health check surveys on them at 3 months and at 6 months. And over that time, what we've seen is that their overall body condition and weight has increased in that time. So that just shows us that this environment is providing all the right resources they need to thrive, and that following that move from the source environments, they've been able to adapt and settle in pretty well. We've got a young bilby here. It's about 500 grams. It represents the first generation of bilbies born in the park. So you'll see as I let this one go, it's very small, but it's in fantastic condition, and yeah, they're clearly thriving in their new environment. At this point in time, 6 months after release, we're seeing animals at different stages of development. We're seeing some that were the pouch young that we released during the original translocation. So these animals are now about 900 grams. They're entering a stage where they're basically teenage bilbies running around. Then we're also now seeing the first new generation of animals that were conceived and born into the park. They're also now independent, so they've left their mothers, and they're about 500 grams in size. They're incredibly cute, but they're just starting to make their way into the population. And now we're also at a point where we're starting to see the second generation of pouch young inside the pouches of the mothers. So it's a really great sign, and it really underscores the importance of these projects, that we can ensure the future of such an amazing Australian animal in the long term.
So I might just talk a little bit to that, Ignacio. We're really trying to learn from our investment in translocations. This is a typical project. This is the one I showed before that had all the paperwork. This type of science and monitoring we do around this is quite a bit of work at the sort of source site to make sure we've got enough animals to look at their genetics, to look at disease if that's likely to be an issue. And then once we do the translocation, I'm sure all the practitioners here do this sort of stuff. We do telemetry, we trap if we can, we look at condition, we take genetic samples of the population down the track to see how things are going. And we have a research program. We're looking at these are animals that haven't been in these landscapes since Western ecology has been developed as a discipline. So we're doing a lot of just basic ecology work. What do these animals do in these landscapes? What are their impacts on the other fauna? What are their impacts on the vegetation and the ecological processes? We're also, like a number of groups in Australia, trying to crack this problem of how do you get these animals outside the fences and the islands. So we did a big project in a place called Scotia, which is right in the dry part of sort of southwest New South Wales. And this is the telemetry results, GPS points for foxes that we collared there. And the fenced area is that bit. So the fence actually works, it keeps out the foxes. But you can see that everywhere else you wouldn't want to be a native animal out there. It's every bit of country is patrolled and and the sort of interesting stuff, this is foxes going to water points in summer. So we learnt a lot about the foxes from that. We did the same for cats. And we've blown right out here because what we found, which we didn't expect, was cats were travelling 100 kilometres and back down to the Murray River, over into the next state. Who knows why, right? But clearly has massive implications if you're trying to control cats with a local baiting program and they're able to walk 100 kilometres in from the neighbouring state. You've clearly got to expand the sort of scale of your operations. So we've done a lot of that sort of work in sort of trying to build up our understanding of the system that we're trying to manage. I just want to show that this is just a list of publications that someone sent me on topics from this arid recovery place. Basically, all the main projects are doing similar levels of intensive work around the species they're introducing and the outside the fence type of problem. So that's arid recovery, and this is this Mulligan's Flat. So again, lots and lots of work being done around the science part of our conservation work. And I agree with Mike before from the US when he said the real end game is to have more, what do you say, more wildlife in nature or whatever, more, we think of it as more numbats out in the bush or bilbies. But getting the papers published, getting peer review, getting communication out there to your peers is also important. So, advice. Look, Jamie gave me some advice, which is brave, given that he reports to me ultimately. Everyone gave some advice, and I'm not expecting you or even wanting to read it out, but the advice about, you know, what to do, what should we be doing, came in several flavours. One was technical, you know your species, know your situation, plan well, monitor well, communicate, etc. There was stuff around long-term commitment, long-term funding, a bit about communication. Jamie had a point about being open about your failures. Clearly that's a bit of an issue for an NGO where you're raising money off your successes, but we do have failures and we need to be brave enough to say we failed, but we've learnt from that. I summarise it really as, you know, having a vision based on knowledge of the past and knowledge of the present, and being determined and being pragmatic in your determination because you want to achieve a goal. Shall I talk about the future? Yeah. While I've got the stage? Thanks, Ignacio. So look, an interesting thing happened a few years ago. The Commonwealth Government in Australia funded a consortium of universities, and we were also involved, AWC, in a sort of conservation science academic program that was supposed to have real-world sort of outcomes. One of the things we did, we had a few workshops and we tried to figure out which of the Australian mammals were really vulnerable to cats and foxes, because they're the ones that you need to focus some of this fenced area or island translocation work on. So in particular, what we're really interested in is the ones that were rated highly or extremely vulnerable to cats and foxes. You can see the ones that are extremely vulnerable, more of them are dead than alive, right? They've really suffered. Then we did a table of, okay, for those species that are really vulnerable, which have this part of the graph shows how many populations they've got on islands or fences that don't have any cats or foxes. And over half were protected in some way through that mechanism, but at the time there were nearly 30 species that had no secure populations. So they're obviously the targets of where we should be looking at our work in the future. And in fact, those stars I've added to this graph are species, the 6 species that we've added to the protected list in the last 4 years. We've also, this group's also done some mapping of where you'd put those fenced areas to, you know, conservation ecologists love optimisations. This is a spatial optimisation of where you'd build new fenced areas in Australia. It annoyed me dramatically because they didn't actually talk to us when they did this part of it. And if they had, they would realise that we were building projects in some of these areas and would have changed their outcome. I guess the other interesting thing for me is it's not just an optimisation problem. You can't just say, go to, you know, this area here, that's our property, and they've identified, actually, you should just go north of our property to build this fenced area. But it matters who owns the land and what organisations' capacity to do. Conservation translocations is we've only been in it for 30 years. We've got to be in it for forever, really. You can't pick up any organisation to do this. You can't get a dysfunctional organisation to do it. So the social aspects of it were ignored by the study, which I found interesting. Since this work was done, we've had these megafires, and they've uplisted, as I said, another 80 species, of which 14 species were mammals in this size range that are really vulnerable to cats and foxes. And we picked up 2 of them in this fence on Kangaroo Island, but there's another 12 that haven't been picked up. So I guess I'm saying this is the extinction crisis in Australia is very dynamic, it's very fast moving, and we're flat out keeping up with it despite massive investment in new projects. Where people are moving, where we're moving and where other organisations are moving are to a sort of hybrid thing where you've got a fenced area. So this is our Matt Gibson project. We've got a fenced area. We've got 8 species in there, no cats or foxes. They're all doing pretty well. But we want to try to get some animals out into the broader landscape. So we've left the 2 sort of tougher species to last. I don't know if any of you know the brush-tailed possum. We introduced it or it was introduced in New Zealand, where it's quite predatory. And if you ever have them in your roof and you try to trap them out of there, they'll absolutely rip your arms off. So they can sort of hold their own, right? And so, but they're not threatened. So this is the first species we let outside the fence with a baiting program, and we put some inside the fence just in case it didn't work. But actually, we had 100% survival in both situations. And this year, we're aiming for the threatened species, which is the western quoll, it's firstly just going to go outside the fence. And other proponents are doing just the same sort of thing. So this couple here, Catherine and John, have been involved in conservation translocations for longer than me. And in fact, I did recommend to Ignacio that if you wanted some real maestros from Australia, you'd get this couple. John has built a device that is sort of based on LiDAR and camera trap technology that when it sees a cat, it sprays poison on it and the cats groom that poison off. So that's their tool for reducing cat populations outside the fenced area. So they've got a fenced area and then outside, and they've got this idea about the trying to select for attributes in the native mammals that recognise the introduced predators and can cope. That's the theory. This arid recovery place I talked about before with all the different fences in the desert, that's doing exactly the same thing. They've had some really interesting publications where they've shown that if they do expose things like the bilby, we've seen lots of videos of bilbies, if they expose them to cats at low densities, they become more aware of cats and they survive longer. But actually, it just not enough, right? They still, if you let them go in the open landscape, that increase in awareness is not enough to stop them getting absolutely smashed. So we've still got a long way to go. The academics at ANU working at Mulligan's Flat, they've gone right into the more sort of theoretical side of this. So they're looking at, they call this the Goldilocks zone, the zone which there's sufficient selection over long enough time that you can, the hope is, evolve those behaviours or maybe even body size or something to escape. They're also interested in selection on the predators themselves, and they're saying that if you're just killing all the predators, there's no selection to not take those animals. You've got to try to develop an aversion to taking native animals. It's like trying to develop an aversion in foxes to taking chickens, I think. I think it's a big ask. But anyway, that's what they're trying to do. In AWC, we're part of a group of people who think actually we'd like just a silver bullet. So we've been part of a broader group of people talking about the potential for gene drive to essentially control populations of feral cats and foxes through things like, shredding the X chromosome, etc., turning all the males to dust. There's some trials happening in mice in Adelaide in Australia. But it's not working out too well. It turns out that the genome's quite resistant to manipulation to destroy it. But anyway, it may come off, right? It may come off, but we've probably got 20 or 30 years at least before it does. And then we've got the issues to consider of what if we develop a genetically modified cat that someone brings back to Europe, right? Or a rabbit. So there's some big issues to consider there. couple more slides about the future. Climate change is really biting in Australia. Where it's most prominent is in the southwest of Western Australia, which is actually where a lot of the mammals survived, just through some quirk that I can talk about over beer, but basically it's drying out very quickly, and so our projects there are at risk of being unsuitable in the future. So we've done some climate modelling, looking at the climate envelopes, where they're going to be for these species we're conserving, and it turns out that none of our projects are going to be in the zone, according to this modelling, in the next 30 or 50 years. So we've starting to think about acquiring land down in this red area, down in that part of the sort of map. A lot of it's cleared, so we'd have to revegetate it and look at it as habitat down the track. But that's where we're thinking with these projects, putting quite a lot of work into as detailed climate modelling as we can, where we can, using physiological models where they're available. I wanted to finish with the advice that people like Jamie and others about where we're going. They picked up a lot of these same sort of topics, of course. There was also recognition by Jamie and this chap Peter Copley down the bottom, who's been doing this stuff for 40 years. That there's a recognition that we're getting better at what we're doing. There's going to be more of it. And with that, maybe will come a willingness from government to loosen some of the shackles of constraints that they impose. But there's still a hell of a long way to go with managing the populations, or establishing the genetics, the sort of interactions, and climate change is bringing us right back around to where we were 150 years ago. We're going to have to start doing introductions again. We're going to have to be moving species out of their current range to where it will be suitable under a hotter and drier climate. So the wheel is turning. And I think that's it for me from the slides, Ignacio, unless you wanted to talk.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jan. And you were talking about the future, okay? So let's look into the future, and let's imagine that everything goes right, and you have more reserves, and you recover lots of these small mammals, and everything goes as desired, heaven, paradise. So you're going to have an island that will be full of mesomammals, which will be some omnivorous, some vegetarian, whatever, herbivorous. You have no grazers, you have no native grazers, you have no large herbivores, you have no large predators because they went extinct. So that's a totally different scenario from the ecological restorations in other places. So imagine that paradise happens and you have this island full of animals this size in an ecosystem that evolved with animals of huge sizes. So what's the discussion about that? I mean, and there's going to be problems of seed dispersal, lack of grazing, things like that. At the same time, you are controlling exotic herbivores. So what's kind of the discussion about that, and how do you see the future?
Well, Deli asked me that question over lunch, and look, so a couple of answers. Firstly, by biomass, introduced herbivores, cattle, horses, camels, are 99% of the Australian faunal biomass. They are absolutely dominant in most ecosystems, even in the ones we manage. Because they're so big, you don't need many of them to make up for a few rodents. I guess the ecological response is that Tim Flannery, who some of you may know is an Australian sort of paleontologist, climate dude, wrote a book back in 1994 called The Future Eaters, which is about when the Aborigines, I'm presuming, hunted the megafauna to extinction. They quickly replaced that with managing the country by fire. And there's some really good paleontological evidence for that. And the patchiness that the herbivores used to create was now created by fire. So when we manage the country and when other conservation groups manage the country, we do a fire program over 3 or 4 million hectares of northern Australia every year. We do a lot of fire management to create the patchiness that the large herbivores would have created 50,000 years ago. Whether, you know, once we get far into the Anthropocene, right, once climate change really bites and we're really struggling, maybe then we'll have a discussion around ecological analogues, but we're not at that point yet. We're still looking back, trying to save what was.
Okay, thank you.